case that I've seen customers use our API for is when they want to automate the provisioning of the infrastructure that Aria Automation runs on. So if you want to, instead of manually creating cloud accounts, cloud zones, Kubernetes zones, projects, image mappings, flavor mappings, instead of creating those things in a manual fashion, you could create a program that uses our API to automate that process. Another common use case for this API is if your company already has a web portal that your users are trained to use, instead of having to train the users how to use our user interface, you could modify your web portal using our API to do Aria Automation deployments, but through the interface that your users are already familiar with. My name is Brian Watrous. I am a member of the VCF division of VMware by Broadcom, and we've got a short amount of time, so I'm just going to jump in. Here's our agenda. Let's get started. So, apologies for those of you who are already familiar with Aria Automation, but just to level set here real quickly. If you're not familiar with Aria Automation it enables you to create your own private cloud. With it, you can create a self-service portal that end users can go into to request deployments of all sorts of different things. For example, you could create a template that users can request deployments from to deploy a virtual machine. For example, that's exactly what we're doing here in this code. This YAML code is deploying our infrastructure. In this case, if you look at lines 3 through 11, you can see this template is deploying a vSphere style virtual machine. It has information about that virtual machine, such as what operating system we're going to install. So we're going to install CentOS. We're going to give that virtual machine 1 virtual CPU, a gigabyte of memory, plug it into a network. Speaking of network, that's what lines 12 and onward are defining. Here's the network we want to plug it into. Aria Automation provides a graphical user interface, a command line interface, but what we're here to talk about is its application programming interface. Now, there is some terminology that you need to tackle here, first of all. For example, I've been referring to these things called automation templates. In the old days, they were called blueprints. The API documentation and the API itself still use that term, blueprints. So from here on out, if I say blueprints, which I will, you can think of that as an Aria Automation template or a VCF automation template, but we're going to call them blueprints. Similarly, the product itself has gone through numerous name changes. So any of these 3 product names I mentioned in this presentation mean the same thing. I'm going to try to stick with VCF automation, but I may lapse into the older names. When using REST APIs, those REST APIs typically will run on top of HTTP or HTTPS. And so it's worth taking a few moments to look at the HTTP protocol. One great place to do that is to look at RFC 2616. That RFC defines how the HTTP protocol works. For example, Section 5 defines what an HTTP request looks like. You know how when you use a web browser, you surf to some web page, that's doing an HTTP request. You get back in, HTTP response. So Section 5 and 6 will introduce you to those, but you probably already got the concept there. On the other hand, Section 9 might be new to you. In the world of HTTP, there are HTTP methods, such as the GET method, the POST method, the PUT method, the DELETE method, and others. These 4 are perhaps the most important for our purposes. When you're using that web browser and you get a web page, we're doing a GET on whatever URL you specify. If you use a web browser to upload a page, that's presumably going to do a POST to some URL. The other thing that you need to know about HTTP is that whenever you send a request, when you get back a response, you're going to get back a status code. Let's start with the status code we all know. Have you ever gotten a 404? File not found? 404 fits nicely into the 400 range of codes. If you get back a 400 code, whether it's 400, 401, that's an indication that the client has run into some sort of problem. For example, I can't find this file, client. I don't know what file you're talking about. Similarly, the 500 series code are for server-side problems, but the series of codes that we want to see are the 200 series of code, because they indicate that our request was successful. Now, if you haven't already noticed, I have a QR code, or if you'd rather type the URL. What that QR code is going to take you to is a series of videos that I've created on YouTube that go into what we're talking about today in much, much, much more detail. Hours and hours. I've only got 25 minutes. I've only got 20 minutes now. So if you want that deeper dive, that is a resource you can turn to. It's going to tell you more about the HTTP protocol and goes into lots and lots of hands-on examples. So part one, the first section of that video, the very first video, talks about HTTP. Section 9 of these videos is directly applicable to what we're talking about here today. So when I work with the REST API, I generally go through this sequence of steps. The first thing I need to do before I use any REST API is to make certain I know how to use whatever system it is that's providing that REST API, whatever the system is that I'm trying to automate. I need to know how to use it manually. If I can't do tasks manually through their GUI or their command line, I'm not going to be able to automate it. So familiarize yourself with whatever that external system is. Next, I go looking for the API documentation. Sometimes there's no documentation to be found. That's always exciting, but Aria Automation, VCF Automation, has extensive documentation. I'm going to show you exactly where to go look for it. The next thing I always do is to figure out by reading that documentation what kind of authentication mechanism is this REST server using. Is it using basic authentication where I pass in a username and password? Is it using bearer tokens? Is it using OAuth? There are all sorts of different ones. You don't have to learn them all. I'll show you exactly what you need to know for Aria Automation. So after I've tackled that, I'll read through the API documentation to find out what REST operations they support, and then I'll practice. When I practice, I'll typically either use curl, which is a command line utility, or I tend to prefer using Postman, which provides a graphical user interface. We're going to see Postman here shortly. Right, so that's a quick intro. Let's talk about the API documentation. Where do you get it? How do you read it? Why do you need it? So you can get to the API documentation for the VCF Automation REST API by going either to https://developer.broadcom.com, or you can go to your VCF Automation server, just type in a URL pointing to your VCF Automation server and add /automation-UI/API-docs. Slight typo there, it's API/docs. When you go to that documentation, it's going to look like this to start off with. It's going to show you these major categories of things that you can do. The categories are actually separate APIs. The VCF Automation REST API is actually a collection of APIs. It's easier to talk about it, though, as if it was just one. So you can do all sorts of things. This is not a complete list by any stretch of the imagination. The screenshot's truncated, but one of the things we can see here is that there's a whole section where you can find out what kinds of things you can do with blueprints. So let's open that up and look at the blueprint documentation. Well, if you look in any of the documentation, it starts off by telling you some general information, including the URLs that we're going to use. You can do things like add order by equals ascending or order by descending to control what order the information is returned to you. So do you want to see the newest blueprints first or the oldest blueprints first? Additionally, it will show you your base URL that you're going to use extensively with the API. And if you continue scrolling downwards, this blueprints category has subcategories of things you can do. We're going to focus right now on these two. So blueprint is where you can go to find out how to do things like look up a blueprint or create a new blueprint through the API. On the other hand, if you want to automate a deployment from a blueprint, that's in the blueprint request section. So let's drill into the blueprint section. In the blueprint section, each of these colorful different lines is representing a different REST API that you can invoke. For example, the very first operation here says that if you do a GET, remember that's one of those HTTP methods, if you do a GET, specify your base URL, HTTPS, Aria Automation Server, and then add this to your URL, that will instruct the VCF Automation REST API that you want to look up all of the blueprints. On the other hand, if you change your request just slightly and said you wanted to do a post, same URL, but post means you want to create a new blueprint. If you add a blueprint ID, I'll show you how to look them up in a moment, but use otherwise the same URL, you can look up more information about a specific blueprint. You can update a blueprint, you can delete a blueprint, and there's a whole bunch of other things you can do. Let's take a look at the first request. So this operation will allow you to look up all of the blueprints. To use it, again, it's telling us here's the form and the URL, here's the HTTP method that you need to use, and then in the parameter section, it describes for you parameters that you can add to the URL. They're called query parameters, but parameters that you can add to the URL to cause the API server to behave a little differently. For example, instead of seeing 100 blueprints, if you have 100 blueprints, instead of seeing all 100 blueprints, you can use the size parameter to say, I just want to see 10 at a time. You can use the page parameter in conjunction with that to jump to whichever page of blueprints you want to look at. If you continue scrolling down in the documentation, there are other query parameters you can specify. For example, if you want to search for just one blueprint by its name, you can use the name parameter. Scrolling down further, there's a very important parameter here called API version. We're going to learn about that one here in a few moments. As you continue scrolling down in the documentation, you get to the responses section. In this section, it will tell you all of the possible response codes that you may get back. Remember the 200 series means good, success. So if you got a 200 response, the response body is going to look essentially like this. It's going to tell you things like when was a particular blueprint created, who created it, when was it last updated, what's its ID. Very first thing you get is the ID of the blueprint, which we've already seen in the documentation is something that we can add to the URL to get more information about a specific blueprint. But things don't always work the way you want. You're not always going to get a 200, so let's scroll down and look at more response codes. You might get a 400, meaning there's something wrong with your request. Or if you get a 401, that means you're authenticated, but you don't have the privileges to do what you're trying to do. You might just be logging with an end user account that is not allowed to see the blueprint information. On the other hand, 403 means you're not authenticated at all. So, like most of the REST operations, in order to do these REST operations, you have to be authenticated. So we're going to talk about that again in a moment. Let's talk about those API versions. By the way, this is Postman if you've never seen it before. In Postman, you can see I've defined a number of different collections. So for example, here's a collection called VRA8. It contains subfolders that I'm using to organize my REST operations. I'll show you those in a moment. If you would like to have access to this collection that I'm describing today, plus these others that show up in those videos I talked about before, that's what that QR code's going to get you. So what we're just about to do here is to go into this folder I created called About. And it's going to contain two different REST operations that we can run. I see a few more folks taking photos. All right, so let's go into About. Two operations. The first REST operation is called get API info, or in hindsight, I would have called it get API version info. So if we open up that request, you can see that it's going to perform a get. Again, here's the base URL. I'm storing my actual FQDN for my VCF automation server in a variable. But if you want to get version info, you just say /IAS/API/about. I learned that by reading the documentation. REST operations sometimes require parameters. In the case of this operation, it's so simple you don't need any parameters. Sometimes, most of the time, you need to authenticate. But with this REST operation, you do not need to authenticate. Headers allow you to pass additional control information to the REST server to tell it how you want it to behave. There are a lot of different headers, but I would draw your attention first to this one called accept. By setting the accept header for our API, you can control what format the data is in when it's returned to you. So would you like to see it in XML? Would you like to see it in JSON? The default, which we're using here, is JSON. Some requests require that you fill out a body. This simple request does not. Some of the operations that I defined here, I'm going to write some code in JavaScript to do some cool things, but not yet. Scripts, again, is where you do that. Settings is where I needed to go. In my lab environment, I use self-signed certificates, so I turned off the validation of certificates. Right, so armed with that, let's see what happens when we send this request. Now, before we do, the very first thing you check every single time when you send a request is you need to check the response status. So let's hit send. First thing we do is we check to see the status. We got back a 200, that's good. If we got back something else, we'll need to do something about that. But we got back a 200. Up above, we have defined the REST request. Down below, you can see the REST response. Now, as you can see, Postman has these different tabs you can click on to view the response different ways. Maybe this is just me, but I tend to like to look at my responses in something else, such as a text editor or a code editor. For example, if I click the copy button, I could take this code into something as simple as Notepad++, which gives me the benefit that I can expand or collapse these different sections. It just makes it easier for me to read the code. So this is our response. If you look at our response, line number 2 says that the response contains an array. Lines 3 through 9, lines 3 through 10 are the first element in this array. That first element tells me what we call this version. So this is a specific version. There's a version called 2019-01-15. Anything interesting about that one that you see? Yeah, that one's old. It's deprecated, and the API will tell you that's deprecated. Don't use this. Continue onwards, we have additionally another element in our array. That element is for the 2021 version of this API, and that one's valid. So right now you're asking yourself, why do we care about these version numbers? The reason why you care about these version numbers is by using these version numbers in your URLs that your REST client is sending, you can lock your client to a specific version of our REST API so that you're not getting back unexpected results when you go from one server to another that may have different latest versions. Speaking of which, there's a piece of info here. For this Aria Automation server, the latest version of the API is the 2021 version. Now, that information's valuable because we're going to want to add that again and again and again to these URLs. So let's save that information. So we just saw that in the response body, there's a piece of data called latest API version. I'm saving that into a Postman variable called VRA_API_version. So I can just put that variable up here in the URL for all my subsequent requests, and it will know what version I want. So this is the code that's actually doing it. This is the response. This is the piece of data I want. This is how you can get to it. This is how you can store it as a postman variable. Let's learn how to authenticate to the VCF Automation REST API. You need 2 tokens. The first is called the API token, also known as the refresh token. The second is called your access token. The access token is ultimately the one that you really need, but you got to get the first one first. So to do that, in my collection, I've defined a folder called authentication, and I have 2 REST operations defined here. One to get the first token, the access token, and the second to the API token, and the second to get the access token. So let's see how we get the first token. This is the URL. Again, I know the URL by looking in the API documentation. Notice I am now passing in a parameter. That's that API version that we just looked up. And I'll do that for all my subsequent requests. In terms of authorization, you don't need to authenticate to the REST server in order to authenticate. That's sort of circular. So no authentication just yet. We're getting our authentication. So headers. This time, in addition to accept, which says what format I want the data returned in this instance, I'm also going to set content-type to tell the REST server, here's the format that I'm sending the REST request in. So I am going to send you, REST server, some JSON. Let's take a look at the JSON. The body of this request is using this JSON formatted data to pass in the username, the password, and the domain name that I want to authenticate with. These are the same credentials I would use if I was logging into the GUI. These variables and that variable, all those Postman variables are defined in Postman in this section called environments. So here's some example variables. There's my VRA server FQDN. Here's my username. Here's my password. Here's my domain. So that's where all these variables are coming from. It's also where I'm setting all these variables. So let's go back to the collections. Again, what we're going to get back in the response code in a moment is a piece of data called refresh token. That's the first token that we need. So let's send our request. Sure enough, here's our refresh token. So we grab the refresh token with this piece of code, and we're sticking it into this Postman variable called API_token. So we've got our first token, but how many tokens do we need? We need 2. So let's get the second one. To get the second token, the access token, it's largely the same. You're going to do this URL. Again, I'm passing an API version. Authorization, I'm not authenticated yet. I'm trying to get authenticated, so nothing to say here. Same headers as before, but the body this time is not the username, password, and domain. This time it's that refresh token that we just got. Send it. A little ahead of myself. Let's take a look at the scripts. This pre-request script that gets run before the request gets sent is simply logging that refresh token. The post-response code is the more important stuff here. The response is going to have a piece of data labeled token, and that's what I'm trying to get. So I send the request, I get back the token, I save it in a Postman variable, and then I can pass that in to all my subsequent requests. All right, I'm a little low on time, so let me jump ahead here to blueprint operations. If you want to look up all the blueprints, here's the URL, but notice this time we must authenticate. I could either, in that request, I could either say, I'm hard coding the bearer token, the thing that we just got, into this request, or a better idea, since I'm going to need to pass this token into probably all the requests, is to put that token someplace higher up in this hierarchy. I could put that token in this blueprints folder, in which case I don't have to specify authentication for these, or better yet, if I put it up at the collection level, that token can be inherited by everyone. So at the collection level, It too has an authorization tab, and we can set the bearer token there. And then the rest of this process is essentially the same. You're going to fill out the tabs. You're going to send a request, and what you're going to get back contains information about all the blueprints. Let's look at that in Notepad++. This is essentially what kind of information you're going to get. Now, I'm actually out of time, but remember that there are those videos. If you didn't catch the videos, I'd be happy to point you them. But there are videos that go into much more detail to help you continue on the journey that we've just started. I will stick around to answer questions, but I know that there's going to be another session starting up pretty darn quick. So if you have questions, just follow me off the side of the stage, and I'd be happy to answer any of those. But thank you, everyone, and enjoy your journey with the REST API.